The arrow came out of nowhere, singing through the cold morning air like a whispered death, and Zora Fireblood stepped in front of it before she had even made the conscious decision to move. The market square of Dunhallow was just beginning to wake up when it happened. Cart wheels groaned over the cobblestones. The baker's boy was hauling a tray of ash-dusted rolls to his mother's stall. Two old women argued over the price of river fish near the stone well. The smell of tallow candles and horse dung hung over everything like a familiar blanket, ordinary and unremarkable, the kind of morning that seemed incapable of holding disaster. Henry Dalton had been loading bolts of dyed cloth into the back of his wagon when the snap of a bowstring split the air. He turned just in time to see the blur of the shaft, and then Zora, the orc woman who ran the leather goods stall beside his own, step hard to the left and take the arrow through the meat of her right shoulder. She did not fall. She stumbled one step, then planted her feet and stood there with the shaft jutting from her shoulder like a grim flag, her green jaw set so hard her tusks showed, her amber eyes scanning the rooftops. Henry dropped the bolt of cloth and ran to her. "Get down," he said, grabbing her arm, trying to pull her behind the wagon, but she resisted him with a strength that still surprised him after 3 months of sharing market space with her. "Shooter is on the tannery roof," she said, her voice flat and controlled in a way that made it clear she was working very hard to keep it that way. "He will not have another arrow knocked yet. Window is closing." From across the square, a shout went up. A man in a patched brown coat, the kind worn by men who thought themselves invisible, scrambled back from the tannery's edge and disappeared behind the ridgeline. A few market-goers screamed. Most simply stared, that particular frozen stare that people use when they have witnessed something their minds are not ready to file away. Henry did not let go of her arm. "Come here," he said, and this time he did not pull, he simply held, kept himself close, kept himself between her and the tannery roofline until they were crouched behind the wagon's solid oak side. "You have an arrow in your shoulder, Zora." "I am aware," she said. "That was meant for me," he said quietly. She looked at him then for the first time since the arrow had struck her, and her amber eyes were steady and very direct. "Yes," she said. "Why?" he asked. And she held his gaze for a moment that seemed to stretch beyond its own length, that strange gravity of a question that already carries its answer inside itself. "Mine," she said simply. Henry Dalton stared at her. The single word landed in his chest like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples moving outward through everything he thought he understood about the last 3 months, about the quiet orc woman at the leather stall, about the morning she had offered him oiled wrapping for his cloth bolts when rain was coming, about the evening she had lingered a few minutes longer than packing her stall required, about the way she sometimes looked at him when she thought he was not looking back. He was 26 years old and had been running trade routes between Dunhallow and the eastern settlements for 4 years. He had learned to read roads and weather and the subtle dishonesty of merchants who watered their dye. He had not, apparently, learned to read this. "Zora," he said, his voice coming out lower than he intended, "we need to get you inside." She turned her head and looked at the arrow shaft with the kind of professional assessment that struck him as wildly inappropriate for the moment. "The head did not go through. Barbed, probably. It will need to come out." "Then we are definitely going inside," he said. "Can you walk?" "I walked into a battlefield at 17, she said. "I can walk to your in-room." He helped her up, keeping his body between her and the still-open square, and they moved quickly across the cobblestones. The baker's boy stood frozen with his tray. Henry caught the boy's eye. "Tell the town constable there was a shooter on the tannery roof," he said, and pressed a copper coin into the boy's palm and kept moving. Dunhallow's Wayfarers' Inn was called the Copper Fleece, and it smelled of wood smoke and old straw and the faintly sweet rot of spilled ale. The innkeeper, a wide woman named Bess Hollowell, looked up from her counter when Henry came through the door with Zora beside him, and her expression cycled through surprise and wariness and, to her credit, practical concern faster than most people could have managed. "Arrow," Henry said. "I can see that," Bess said. She was already moving out from behind the counter, already reaching for the linen strips she kept in a cedar box under the stairs. Because Dunhallow sat at the crossroads of four trade routes and Bess Hollowell had not survived 30 years of innkeeping without knowing how to deal with injured travelers. She glanced at Zora with an expression that was not quite welcome, but was at least the absence of outright hostility. "Bring her to the back room." The back room of the Copper Fleece was a small, low-ceilinged space that smelled of dried herbs and lamp oil, used for storage but also occasionally for exactly this kind of necessity. There was a cot against one wall, a small table, and a lamp that Bess lit with practiced efficiency. Henry helped Zora sit on the cot. She sat straight, which he suspected was less about comfort and more about pride. "I can remove it," she said, reaching for the shaft with her left hand. "You will make it worse," Henry said. "Let me look." She went still. Not compliant exactly. It was more like she paused the argument in order to assess him, to decide whether his hands were worth trusting. He met her gaze and tried to look steady, which was somewhat challenging because his heart was hammering, and he had not yet processed the full reality of what she had done. She had stepped in front of an arrow meant for him. He had been aware, in a distant and unexamined way, that there were people in Dunhallow who resented his trade relationship with her. He carried Eastern goods, leather harnesses, tool rolls, oiled saddle pouches that she produced and he distributed, a partnership that had begun as simple mutual convenience and had become, over 3 months, something considerably more comfortable. Some of the other merchants disliked it. The Havert brothers, who ran a competing leather operation on the west side of the square, had made their feelings plain through a series of escalating unpleasantries, spoiled stock showing up near her stall, a thrown stone that she had deflected without comment, whispered words that Henry had heard and quietly reported to the town constable, who had done nothing. He had not thought it would come to this. "The shaft is steady," he said, examining it carefully. His hands were careful and gentle. He could feel her watching his face rather than his hands. "Barbed, like you said, but it has not gone deep enough to hit anything critical, I think. It is in the muscle of the shoulder outside edge." He looked up at her. "I have pulled bolts before, from animals, from one time from myself." "From yourself," she said, and something shifted almost imperceptibly in her expression. Interest, maybe, the beginnings of the kind of respect that required evidence. "Hunting accident," he said. "I was 19 and I thought I knew more than I did." "That is a very human age for that kind of mistake," she said. "I expect orc hunters do not make those mistakes." "They do," she said. "They simply do not survive them as often." And there it was, not quite a smile but the shadow of one, the faint softening around her amber eyes, and it landed in him the same way the word mine had, opening something up. He cleaned the wound with the spirits Bess brought, and worked the barbed head out with 2 careful cuts from his skinning knife, which he sterilized in the lamp flame, and then in spirits, while Zora breathed steadily through her nose, and did not make a sound except once, a single sharp exhale that she seemed to be almost angry at herself for producing. He packed the wound with the yarrow and comfrey poultice that Bess produced from a clay jar, and bound it tightly with linen strips. When it was done, Zora sat in the lamplight with her right arm in a sling made from his own neck scarf, the green wool one his mother had sent from Taro, and she looked at him with those steady amber eyes, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. "The Haverts," Henry said at last. "Most likely," she agreed. "I am going to report this properly," he said. "With a witness this time. I will pay the constable's surcharge if I have to." She was quiet. In Dunhallow, and in most towns of its kind that dotted the frontier between the eastern settlements and the old Orc territories, the formal mechanisms of law moved slowly and selectively, and they moved slowest of all when the injured party was not human. Henry knew this. He suspected Zora knew it even better than he did. "I appreciate the intention," she said, which was a careful and diplomatic way of saying that she did not expect much from it. "Then I will handle it another way," he said. She looked at him sharply. "I do not need your violence on my behalf." "I was not thinking of violence," he said. I was thinking of economics. She studied him for a moment. Then she said, "What are you thinking?" "I am thinking that the Havert brothers have a contract with the mills in Corin's Pass to supply harness leather for the spring hauling season. I happen to know the purchasing agent at those mills. I happen to have done him a good turn last autumn when I caught one of his drivers stealing grain." Henry kept his voice level. "I will not threaten the Haverts. I will simply let the purchasing agent know that there is a better supplier available who produces finer work for a fairer price. The market will do the rest." Zora looked at him for a long time. "That," she said at last, "is remarkably well thought out for a man who is also, I notice, bleeding from a cut on his hand." He looked down. One of the barb's edges had caught him during the extraction and he had not noticed. "Small," he said. "Let me see it," she said. And so the physician became the patient, and Zora wrapped his hand with the same efficient competence she brought to everything, her strong green fingers moving with a care that was at odds with her general manner of controlled reserve. And Henry watched her face while she worked and felt something inside him shift permanently, like tectonic plates deciding they had finished with their previous arrangement. He stayed that day. He canceled his afternoon visits to the two cloth buyers he had planned to see, and he stayed, and they really talked, for the first time, beyond the pleasantries of neighboring market stalls. He learned that she was 24 years old, that she had come to Dunhallow from the Orc settlement of Grafin 3 years ago, that she had learned leatherwork from her uncle Dorak, who had run a tanning operation near the old border before the settlement agreements had opened the frontier towns to mixed residents. He learned that she had a younger brother named Cale, who was studying the old script with a human scholar in Taro. He learned that she slept badly in Dunhallow because the inn walls were thin, and the human merchants on either side of her room snored, and she had taken to sleeping with her window open despite the cold, which she preferred to the noise. She learned that he had taken over his father's trade route at 22 when his father's knees gave out, that he had a sister in Taro named Marta who was married to a smith, that he had been saving toward a permanent stall with a roof because the sun was hard on the dyed cloth. She learned that he took his meals alone because he found group eating at the common tables loud and disorienting. She learned that he had 3 months ago deliberately arranged his wagon so that its side faced toward her stall rather than away from it, because he liked looking at her work, the close-stitched patterns she pressed into the leather with a heated tool, intricate and precise, the kind of craft that required both strength and absolute delicacy. He did not tell her that last part, not yet. But he stayed, and the afternoon turned to evening, and Bess brought them both a bowl of the barley soup she kept on the fire all day, and they ate in the warm lamplight of the back room of the Copper Fleece, and outside the autumn wind came in off the eastern hills and pressed cold fingers against the shuttered windows, and inside it was warm and close, and entirely unlike anything Henry Dalton had felt since his life had settled into its current reliable and somewhat lonely pattern. When he finally stood to go, he stopped at the door. "I will check on you in the morning," he said. "You do not have to," she said. "I know," he said. "I want to." She held his gaze. "All right," she said, and he thought he detected, beneath the composed amber surface of her eyes, something that might have been relief. He reported the shooting to the town constable the next morning, with the arrow shaft as evidence and Bess Hollowell as witness to the wound treatment. The constable, a broad, tired man named Aldrich, whose office was attached to the back of the grain exchange, took the report with the particular practiced blankness of a man who did not plan to do very much with it. But he took it, and when Henry followed up by mentioning that he intended to write his account of events to the regional magistrate at Corin's Pass, something sharpened in Aldrich's expression. "That seems an escalation," Aldrich said carefully. "A woman was shot on market day," Henry said, "from a rooftop. In the middle of town, I think escalation is exactly appropriate." The constable looked at him for a moment, then looked at the arrow shaft on his desk, then looked at the window with the expression of a man calculating angles. "I will speak with the Havert brothers," he said finally. "I appreciate that," Henry said. "I will hold off on the letter to the magistrate until I see what that conversation produces." It produced, within 2 days, a formal notice posted in the square declaring that an unnamed party had been found responsible for the unsafe discharge of a weapon in the market precinct, and that said party had agreed to pay a fine and vacate their stall lease. The Haverts did not lose their business. They simply lost their presence in Dunhallow's daily market, which was a significant financial inconvenience. Whether Aldrich had truly determined their guilt or had simply decided that the path of least resistance required offering Henry something convincing, Henry neither knew nor particularly cared. He reported none of this to Zora directly. He mentioned casually on the third morning when he came to change her dressing that the shooter had been identified and sanctioned. She listened to this with the focused attention she brought to all information, then said, "The constable moved quickly." "He had motivation," Henry said. She looked at him. "You gave him motivation." "I gave him a clear picture of the situation," Henry said. The corner of her mouth curved. It was small, and it was brief, but it was real, and it was the first time he had seen it properly, the first time it had been directed at him with the full and conscious weight of her attention behind it. He felt it like the first real warmth of spring after a long winter, that sudden quality of light that makes you realize you had forgotten what warmth felt like. He was careful. He understood, with a clarity he had not needed to use before but which felt natural and unforced, that Zora Fireblood moved in a world that had given her considerable reason for caution. She had come to Dunhallow from a settlement and built a business through patience and craft and the careful management of a position that was never fully secure. She had been the object of hostility that ranged from the subtle to the violent. She carried herself with the particular self-sufficiency of someone who had learned that dependence was a liability, and that trust was a resource that needed to be carefully rationed. He was not going to be the person who pushed too fast or presumed too much. He was going to be the person who showed up every morning to change her dressing and stayed to talk, who brought her the good bread from the bakery 2 streets over because it was better than the market stall loaves, who fixed the loose wheel on her display cart without being asked, who said good night at a reasonable hour and left her to her sleep. He was going to be patient. He was very good at patience. It was possibly the thing he was best at. Her shoulder healed cleanly, which she attributed to the quality of the poultice, and he attributed to the quality of her constitution. They argued this point pleasantly on the 6th morning when she removed the sling and rolled her shoulder experimentally with an expression of professional assessment. "Orcs heal faster," she said. "Orcs also," he said, handing her a cup of tea, "apparently step in front of arrows without thinking about it." She accepted the cup. She looked at it, then at him. "I thought about it," she said. He paused. "You thought about it?" "I had approximately half a second," she said. "That is enough time to think." "Zora," he said, setting down his own cup carefully, "you could have been killed." "The angle was wrong for a kill shot," she said. "I assessed it correctly. The risk was manageable." "Manageable," he repeated, the word landing with a kind of baffled weight. "You are a good merchant," she said, which was so apparently unrelated to the conversation that he just looked at her. "You are fair in your prices. You do not lie about the quality of your goods. When you negotiated with me at the beginning, you offered me terms that were better than what I could have demanded. Most human merchants who came to me offered half of what my work was worth because they assumed I did not know better." She looked at her tea. "You knew I knew better. You treated me as someone worth being honest with." The silence stretched. "That seemed worth protecting," she said. He did not know what to say. He sat with her words for a moment in the warmth of the inn's back room, the fire crackling in the small hearth, the sound of the market beginning its day drifting in through the closed shutter, and he felt something settle in him that he had not known was unsettled, some old and quiet loneliness closing its wound. "Zora," he said, and then he stopped, because what came next required more certainty than he had, more knowledge of what she wanted and what she feared and what she would accept. She was watching him with those amber eyes, and they were not unreadable, not to him, not anymore. He could see the same calculation in them that he felt in himself, the same careful measuring of territory. "I would like," he said, "to keep working with you, and I would like, if it is acceptable, to keep talking, the way we have been talking this week." She was quiet for a moment. "In what capacity?" she asked. "In whatever capacity you are comfortable with," he said. "I am not going to rush anything. I just want to be honest that I value your company." Another silence. Outside, the baker's boy was calling out the morning rolls. A horse snorted somewhere near the well. "I am comfortable with talking," she said. "Good," he said. "Then that is what we will do." And so they talked. The autumn stretched into early winter, and the market days thinned as the cold deepened, and the roads became uncertain with mud and the first frosts. Henry's trade route required him to make the 6-day circuit between Dunhallow and the eastern settlements and back, a cycle that kept him away for stretches and returned him reliably. And he found himself measuring the circuit differently than he had before, not by the miles but by the distance from her. He brought her things from the eastern settlements because they were on his route, and it was practical and not at all a declaration of anything. A small jar of the black tanning oil from the Grayville Smiths that she could not source locally. A set of needles made from bone that were finer than the iron ones she used for detail work. A spool of the red-dyed sinew thread that she had mentioned once made the finest reinforcement stitches. She never made a fuss about these things. She accepted them with the particular economy of someone who knew the value of what they were receiving and appreciated it exactly as much as it deserved, no more, no less. But she always had something ready for his return, a hot meal if he came in late, a piece of her detailed stitching work in whatever small functional object she had been making, a knife roll, a book cover, a small tool pouch. She made them ostensibly to test patterns. She left them on his wagon seat without comment. He kept every one of them. By midwinter, the market had gone entirely quiet, and most of the traveling merchants had retreated to wherever they wintered, but Henry had taken a permanent room at the Copper Fleece. His circuit ran year-round, though shorter in the cold months, and Zora kept her stall space and the small room above it, working through the winter on stock for the spring market. In the evenings, they ate together at the Copper Fleece, in the corner table by the small fire that Bess had quietly begun to think of as their table without telling them so. They played dice in the old orc gambling tradition that Zora had taught him, a game of 3 dice called stonecasting that rewarded patience and calculated risk, which he turned out to be somewhat good at. He read to her occasionally from the traveling histories he collected, thin-bound books printed in Corin's Pass that documented the old frontier routes and the settlements along them, and she listened with an attention that most people did not give books, the kind of listening that meant she was filing things away for future use. She told him about Grayfen, about the low stone houses and the communal fire pit, and the festival of the long night in midwinter when the whole settlement stayed awake until dawn and sang the old songs. Songs so old they were in a language even most orcs no longer fully understood, but that they sang anyway, for the weight and the warmth of the tradition. She told him about her mother, a leatherworker also, who had died of a lung sickness when Zora was 15, and how learning her mother's craft had felt like keeping something alive. She told him about her father Ergrin, who was still in Grayfen, old now and stubborn as the stone walls of his house, who wrote to her every season in his careful blunt handwriting, letters that were short and practical and contained, she suspected, everything he did not know how to say out loud. Henry told her about his father, the long, painful year of watching a capable man become limited by his failing body, the complicated love of a son trying to carry something forward while also allowing his father to let it go. He told her about the road, about what it taught you, the weather reading, the horse reading, the people reading, the way a long stretch of open country could feel like loneliness or freedom depending entirely on your state of mind, and how it had felt like loneliness for the last 2 years, and he had not admitted that to himself until this winter. "Why?" she asked. "Because admitting loneliness," he said, turning his dice over in his hands, "requires admitting that something is missing. And if something is missing, you have to decide whether to do something about it or not, and I had not decided." She was quiet for a moment, watching the dice in his hands. "What changed?" she asked. He looked up at her. "You stepped in front of an arrow," he said. She held his gaze. The fire cracked and settled. Bess was wiping down the bar and not looking at them, which meant she was very deliberately not looking at them, which was its own kind of commentary. "That was not a decision," Zora said. "That was a reflex." "Yes," Henry said. "That is exactly what made me decide." The winter deepened and they stayed warm. And in February, when the ice on the horse troughs was thick enough to need breaking with a mallet each morning, Henry came back from a shortened eastern circuit with a cold that had settled in his chest. A riding cold. The kind you got from sleeping under a wagon tarp in frozen air. And Zora appeared in his room at the Copper Fleece the morning after his return, with a clay pot of something she had heated on her stall's small iron brazier. "Black root and pine needle," she said, setting it on his small table. "Orc remedy for chest cold." "Does it work?" he asked, propped up in bed with the quilt his mother had sent him pooled around his waist. "Every time," she said. "It will taste terrible. Worse than the yarrow poultice smelled." "More terrible," she said firmly. He drank it. It was, in fact, terrible. She watched him with her arms crossed and something in her expression that might have been fondness, the kind that people try to keep contained and controlled and that leaks through anyway at the edges. He recovered in 3 days, which was faster than his usual course with chest colds, and whether that was the black root and pine needle or simply the quality of the nursing he received, which included a bowl of actual proper soup every evening, and the company of someone who was good at being still in a sick room, he could not say and did not need to. On the 4th morning, when he came down to breakfast well enough to eat properly, Zora was at her regular table with her work spread out before her, a harness in progress, and she glanced up when he sat down and said, without looking up from her stitching, "You have color back." "Your terrible remedy worked," he said. "I know," she said. He watched her hands move, the strong, precise pull of the needle through the leather, the twist and lock of the sinew stitch, the way she leaned into the work with her whole body. A few weeks passed midwinter, and the morning light was coming through the Copper Fleece's windows at a different angle than it had been, the days stretching by increments, the particular quality of winter light changing from silver to something that had warmth in it even if the warmth had not yet reached the air. "Zora," he said. She looked up. The morning light was on her face, green skin and amber eyes, and the slight curve of her lower tusks that he had stopped noticing the strangeness of some weeks ago and had started noticing the beauty of somewhere around the first frost. "I want to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said, and put down her work. "I have been careful," he said. "I have been patient deliberately because I wanted to be sure of the ground before I said anything, and I wanted you to be comfortable. I do not want to push you anywhere you do not want to go." She was very still, watching him with full attention, those amber eyes steady as ever. "I am in love with you," he said. I wanted to say that plainly, without conditions and without pressure. You do not have to say anything in return, I wanted you to know. The silence was long but not uncomfortable. It was the silence of something being carefully turned over, examined, settled into its place. "I know," she said. He blinked. "You know." "I have known for some time," she said. "Orcs are observant." "And," he said, because he had to. She looked at him with those steady eyes for a moment that lasted several centuries, and then she said, in a voice that was quieter than her usual register, the reserve giving way to something unguarded and direct, "I have been waiting for you to say it." Felt the breath go out of him. "Why didn't you say something?" "Because," she said, and he could see her choosing the words with care, "in my experience, human men who feel something for orc women frequently feel it in ways that are not meant to last. I wanted to be certain that you were certain." "I am certain," he said. She looked at him for one more long moment. Then she reached across the table and took his hand in both of hers, her strong green fingers warm against his, and she said, "So am I." The spring market brought new merchants, new customers, and the particular renewal of commerce that followed every winter's contraction. And Henry and Zora worked the market square together with the easy complementary efficiency of two people who had spent a winter learning each other's rhythms. His cloth brought customers to their end of the market. Her leatherwork sold itself, but Henry's natural ease with people helped move the pieces that required a merchant's pitch. They did not announce anything, because they did not need to. The town of Dunhallow was perfectly capable of reading two people sharing a table, sharing work, sharing the particular quiet of persons who have decided to share their lives. The reception was mixed, which was exactly what they had expected and prepared for. Bess Hollowell was entirely warm in her practical, undemonstrative way. The grain merchant Tomas Pell nodded at Henry with the respect of a man acknowledging a choice that is none of his business. The cloth dyer's wife said something unflattering within Henry's hearing range, and he turned and looked at her with a calm and direct attention until she found other things to occupy herself with. Most people in the end were simply indifferent, because most people's primary preoccupation was their own commerce and survival, and the people they loved, and other people's choices were background noise. A small, persistent minority were hostile, and Henry dealt with them with the same method he had used with the constable's steady persistence, documentation, and the willingness to use the formal mechanisms of civic life as a tool, which was slower and more tedious than confrontation, but considerably more durable in its effects. There was one afternoon in early spring, warm enough that the market had the loosened, expansive quality of a town shaking off winter, when a group of young men from the Mill District decided to express their opinions about Henry's choice of company in the direct vocabulary of thrown garbage. It landed near Zora's stall, not near her, but near a deliberate near, calculated to convey the threat in the direction without committing to the action itself. Henry was 3 stalls away negotiating the price of some river trade goods, and he did not see it happen. Zora dealt with it herself, which she was entirely capable of doing. She stood up to her full height, which was not inconsiderable, and she looked at the young men with an expression so profoundly composed, so entirely absent of the fear they were presumably trying to produce, that 2 of the 3 found themselves taking a step back before they had consciously decided to. The third one held for a moment longer, then took in the fact that Zora Fireblood was built like someone who had been doing physical labor since childhood, that her hands were the hands of a person who worked leather daily, that her gaze held the specific quality of someone who has been through worse and walked away, and he took his step back too. When Henry came back and she told him, quietly, matter-of-factly, he was silent for a moment. Then he said, "I want to go find them." "You will not accomplish anything useful," she said. "I know," he said. "I still want to." "What you will accomplish," she said, "is giving them confirmation that they can affect you, and they cannot." She paused. "And they cannot affect me." He looked at her. "It affects me when someone does that to you." She was quiet. Then she said, "I know, that is different." She met his eyes. "But I am not fragile, Henry. I do not need you to fight everything that looks at me sideways. I need you to stand beside me. There is a difference." He absorbed this. "You are right," he said. "I know," she said again, and the slight amusement in her voice had the effect of reducing the tension by exactly the necessary degree. He stood beside her. It was, he decided, the most important thing he knew how to do. By midsummer they had worked out an arrangement that was practical and also quietly revelatory. Zora's stall became the anchor of a combined operation, leatherwork and textile goods from the same end of the market, with a shared cart and a route that covered the circuit between Dunhallow and 2 of the larger eastern settlements where demand for both categories of goods was reliably high. Henry had been making this circuit alone. Now he made it with Zora, and the difference was not only in the efficiency of the combined inventory, but in the texture of the days themselves. The long miles through the hill country east of Dunhallow, the firelit evenings at way station inns, the mornings on the road when the light was new and the dew was still on the grass, and the horses moved with an easy will and they talked, or were comfortable in silence, both of which felt like exactly the same kind of richness. He asked her father's blessing in a letter. It was a long letter, carefully written over 3 evenings because he wanted to be thorough about who he was and what he intended and what he understood about what he was asking. He sent it with the Autumn Post rider who ran the southern route through Grayfen. The reply came 4 weeks later in the blunt, careful handwriting Zora had described. It said, "My daughter chooses for herself. She has always chosen for herself. I would not try to override that, and I would not disrespect her by pretending otherwise. What I will say is this: if you make her unhappy, I will be very difficult about it. If you make her happy, I will think well of you. That is all." Henry read it twice, then a third time. Then he took it to Zora. She read it and was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "That is the most my father has ever said about his feelings in one piece of writing." "I think he likes me," Henry said. "You should not push your luck," she said. But she was smiling fully and properly now, the smile he had worked to earn over a winter and spring and summer, the one that involved her eyes and the slight upward curl of her lower tusks, and a warmth in her face that he thought might be the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in his life. He asked her that same evening to marry him. Not with ceremony or planning, but because it was the right moment and he was someone who believed in right moments. They were sitting by the fire at the way station inn outside the settlement of Eastham, on the return leg of the autumn circuit, and the fire was making the light move and the inn was mostly empty and quiet, and she was reading his father's old route journal that she had asked to borrow, and he was watching her read it. And it came to him with the absolute certainty of a thing that was already true and merely needed to be spoken. "Marry me," he said. She looked up from the journal with an expression that was entirely composed, entirely Zora, the measured attention she brought to all significant things. "Yes," she said. He blinked. "That was quick." "I have been considering it for 3 months," she said. 3 months, he said. "Since the spring market," she said. "I was waiting for you to ask." "Why didn't you ask me?" he said. She tilted her head with a slight smile. "I asked you the first thing that mattered," she said. "The arrow. After that, I thought it was your turn." He laughed, the easy full laugh of a man who is happy, and she set down the journal and looked at him with those amber eyes full of warmth, and he leaned across the small table and kissed her for the first time, careful and certain, and she let him, and kissed him back with a tenderness that he felt from his mouth to his feet, and the fire crackled, and the inn was quiet, and outside the first autumn stars were beginning to show over the eastern hills. They were married in the spring in Dunhillow's small civic hall, which was where marriages were formalized for the town record. Bess Hollowell was a witness. Tomas Pell was the other. The ceremony was brief and practical, as befitted 2 people who valued function over display. But the words they said to each other were not brief, and not practical at all. Henry had written his own, which he delivered in the steady voice of a man who meant every syllable, and Zora spoke hers in both the common tongue and in the Orc tongue, the old words for partnership and belonging that her Uncle Dorak had written out for her in a letter that she carried folded in her coat pocket. Her father Ergrin came from Grayfen for it, a 2-day ride on a horse that was probably too large for him, a broad, stocky Orc man of 50 who looked at Henry with the measuring attention of someone reading a road, then shook his hand with both of his and said, "She told me you are good with horses and good with accounts, and that you do not talk more than is necessary. These are acceptable qualities." "Thank you," Henry said. Ergrin looked at his daughter with a look that contained all the volumes he had not been able to put in letters, and Zora looked back at him with the same look, and Henry had the sense of witnessing something entirely private and did not need to be any closer to it than he was. His sister Marta came from Taro with her husband the smith, and Marta, who was 22 and had inherited their mother's directness, took one look at Zora and said, "I heard you stepped in front of an arrow for him." Zora confirmed this. Marta said, "Good." He would have let it hit him and then apologized to someone about it. Henry protested that this was not fair. No one agreed with him. The spring after they married, they made a decision that had been building in the background of their conversations for a year. Dunhallow was a market town, good for trade, but the road circuit was long and getting longer as demand grew in the eastern settlements, and the Copper Fleece Room was not, in the long term, a home. They needed something rooted. They found the property outside the settlement of Eastham on the return leg of the spring circuit, 5 acres of mixed land on the eastern slope of the hill country, a small house that had been a way station years ago and was now half ruined, a timber frame barn in better condition than the house, a spring-fed creek running the south edge of the property. The price was low because the house needed rebuilding, and the land needed clearing, and most people considered it too exposed on the eastern side, too close to the old Orc territories, before the settlement agreements had made that distinction mostly irrelevant. Henry and Zora did not consider it too exposed. They considered it perfectly positioned close enough to the eastern circuit to anchor a proper trading post, with land enough for a small operation, and the proximity to Grafin meant that Zora's family and connections in the Orc community were a day's ride rather than 3. They bought it in late spring and spent the summer rebuilding the house, which was the hardest work Henry had done in his life, and also, inexplicably, some of the best. Zora turned out to have a gift for construction that she attributed to summers spent helping her uncle expand his tannery, and she worked with the same focused precision she brought to her leatherwork, an absolute intolerance for imprecision in the joints and mortises, a hand that could feel if a post was a hair off plumb before the level confirmed it. Henry was better at the heavy hauling and the rough framing, and they divided the work with a naturalness that had become the signature of everything they did together. Her brother Cale came for a month in midsummer to help with the heavier work, a young Orc man of 20 who was studying human script, and who regarded Henry with the specific evaluative interest of a younger sibling determining whether his sister's choice was adequate. By the end of the month, he had determined that it was, primarily because Henry had spent considerable time answering his questions about the trade routes and the settlement agreements with the patient completeness that the questions deserved, and because Henry had noticed that Cale's writing tools were poor quality and had replaced them without making a production of it. "He replaced my scribing tools," Cale said to Zora. "He does things like that," Zora said. "You should keep him," Cale said. "I intend to," Zora said. By autumn the house was sound and warm, built to last, with a wide stone fireplace that Zora had laid herself and a set of broad windows that faced east to catch the morning light, and a workshop attached to the north side where she could run her leather operation properly, with the space and the tools that her Dunhallow stall had never had room for. Henry built the workshop shelves and racks to her exact specification, learning in the process that her specifications were never to be varied from even slightly, a lesson that came with 2 dismantled shelf units and 1 long conversation about the importance of listening carefully. He listened carefully. They spent their first winter in the new house, which was different from any winter that had come before it. There was no in-common room, no background noise of other travelers, no borrowed warmth. There was their own fire, their own table, their own bed, their own particular arrangement of the hours. They were good at this, at the domestic architecture of 2 people who had both been largely self-sufficient and who now had to negotiate the overlapping territories of their habits. Henry cooked. Zora had always eaten practically rather than with pleasure, subsisting on whatever required the least time and attention to prepare, and she was frankly dismissive of cooking as an occupation until she ate Henry's slow-simmered venison with dried apricots, and she revised this position entirely. He had learned to cook from his mother, and he did it well, and Zora accepted this competence with the directness she applied to all good work. She simply acknowledged it and benefited from it. Zora managed the property accounts, because she had the kind of mind that moved in numbers with the same precision it moved in stitching. She kept 2 sets of books, one for the trading operation and one for the household, and she reviewed them monthly with Henry in a manner that was entirely businesslike and also, Henry noticed, deeply domestic, sitting across the table with the lamp between them and their heads closed together over the pages. And it was in those moments that the ordinary depth of what they had built together seemed most visible to him, the least remarkable and the most essential. He told her this once, late on a winter evening when the accounts were done and the fire was settling into embers. "The accounts," she said, "sitting across the table from you," he said, "doing something ordinary together. I think it is my favorite thing." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the lamp. Then she said, "Mine too." The word landed with the same quiet weight it had always carried between them, from the very first time she had said it in the market square with an arrow in her shoulder. His. She said it like that still, sometimes, when the conversation reached a place that required it, and it still had that quality of absolute finality, of a claim made from the deepest part of the self, not possessive but belonging, the declaration of a heart that had decided. In their second year on the property, Zora expanded the leather operation to the point where she needed 2 assistants. She hired them herself, both from the settlement at Eastham, a young human woman named Dara who had nimble hands and a willingness to learn, and an older orc woman named Selva who had worked leather in the old territories and whose skill was considerable. Having Selva on the property shifted something in the social architecture of their life. It was one thing for the wider community to see Henry and Zora as an unusual pairing, and another thing for the property to become a place where orc and human craftspeople worked side by side, where Selva and Dara ate their midday meal together at the workshop table, and argued about stitch tension with the comfortable familiarity of people who were primarily interested in the work. Eastham was a larger settlement than Dunhallow, more mixed in its population, closer to the old territories, and therefore more accustomed to the proximity of orcish life. There was less hostility than Henry had been prepared for, though he had learned not to count on that consistency. There were still people who looked at him with the specific confusion of someone who cannot understand why a thing is different from how they expected it to be. He met this with the patient steadiness that had become his characteristic mode, the steadiness that Zora had once called, in a rare moment of extended reflection, your most useful quality, and also occasionally the most irritating one, because it makes it very difficult to argue with you. He had taken this as the compliment it partly was. In the summer of their 3rd year, she told him she was expecting. It was morning, early, the light just coming in through the east windows, and she said it with her characteristic directness, watching his face with an expression that contained both certainty and something that he recognized as its own kind of vulnerability, the temporary suspension of composure that came with the sharing of something that truly mattered. He did not say anything immediately. He crossed the room to her and put both hands on her face and looked at her with everything he had, all the love and the gratitude and the enormous tenderness that had been growing in him for 3 years like a slow fire that was only getting warmer and steadier with time. "Are you frightened?" he asked. She considered this honestly. "A little," she said. "Half-orc children the births can be more difficult. My body and yours are not fully the same. We will have the Eastham healer," he said, "and I will write to your father and to Kale." "Yes," she said, "and I want Selva there. She has delivered children before." "Whatever you need," he said. "Whatever you need, Zora, I will make sure you have it." She looked at him. "I know," she said, and her voice had the quality of absolute trust, the kind that does not need to be argued for or justified, the kind that has been built through the slow accumulation of evidence until it is as solid as the stone fireplace she had laid with her own hands. The pregnancy was difficult in the late months, as she had predicted. The half-orc growth was harder on her frame than a full orc child would have been, and she spent the last weeks unable to work with full range of motion, which frustrated her considerably, and which Henry managed by doing approximately 3 times as much of the physical work as usual, and by being extremely careful never to seem as worried as he felt. The healer came from Eastham for the last 2 weeks. Selva was present. Ergren came from Grafen, arriving at the property with the unannounced efficiency of a man who had decided he was needed and had not required anyone to ask him. He sat in the kitchen and kept the fire and said very little, and his presence was so thoroughly stabilizing that Henry found himself grateful for it in a way he had not expected to be. The labor was long and extremely hard, and Henry held Zora's hand for most of it and spoke steadily and continuously because it was what she had asked him to do. Just talk. Just keep his voice in her ear. It does not matter what you say, just talk. He talked. He talked about the road and the horses and the spring circuit and the new cloth order from the Eastham mills, and the way the creek ran full in spring, and the way the east windows looked in the early morning, and what he had seen on the road when he was 19, and what he planned to build on the north end of the property, and everything he loved about the way she stitched leather, and the way she read books, and the way she slept on her left side with one hand under her cheek. And then there was a child, a boy. Half-orc, with his mother's green skin and his father's nose, and a pair of amber eyes that were going to be exactly Zora's when they settled, and a pair of very small and impressive lungs that he employed immediately and continuously. Zora held him and looked at him with an expression that was entirely new, that broke through every register of composure and reserve, and revealed something underneath that had been there all along, but that Henry had never seen so fully. Just love, pure and unguarded and complete. "Hello," she said to him, softly in the common tongue and then in the orc tongue, the old words that her mother had said to her, that her mother's mother had said. Henry sat beside her with his hand on her back and looked at his son and felt something that he did not have words for in any language, something that was beyond language entirely, the specific enormity of a life you have made with someone you love beyond your own careful capacity to measure it. Ergren came in from the kitchen, looked at his grandson for a long moment and said, "He looks like Dorak at that age." He said this to Zora. Then he looked at Henry and said, "He has your nose." He appeared to consider whether this was acceptable. "It is a reasonable nose," he said. Henry thanked him. They named the boy Dorak, for Zora's uncle, and called him Dory in the common shorthand that the name became on daily lips. He was a loud and active infant who grew into a loud and active child, with his mother's focused intensity and his father's patient sociability, in a combination that produced a personality that was difficult to predict and impossible to dislike. He learned both languages from birth, moving between them with the natural fluency of a child who has never known either as foreign. The trading post on the property became, over the years, a known stop on the Eastern Circuit, not merely a waypoint but a destination, a place where the quality of goods was reliable and the prices were honest and the welcome, regardless of whether you were human or orc or anything in between, was genuine. Henry's reputation from his circuit years was the initial draw. It was what the place became that kept people coming. Zora's workshop grew. She took on more apprentices, 3, then 5, a mixed group that became something of a known quantity in the region, a school for leatherwork that produced craftspeople of a recognizable quality. She taught with the same precision and high standards she had always applied to her own work, the absolute intolerance for imprecision, but she was a patient teacher, and she remembered what it was to be learning, and her apprentices stayed. Dory was 7 when his sister was born, a girl they called Myra, after Henry's mother, with her father's dark hair and her mother's amber eyes, and an expression of serene assessment from her very first days that made Selva say she was going to be a scholar. She was quieter than Dory, more internally focused, the kind of child who watched things carefully before engaging with them. Zora recognized this quality immediately and felt for her daughter the specific tenderness of seeing yourself reflected. By the time Dory was 10 and Myra was 3, the property outside Eastham was no longer remarkable for what it was. It was simply known. People came to it for trade, for leatherwork, for the trading post that had expanded twice over the years, for the spring market that Henry had started in the settlement's central yard, an event that drew merchants from 3 days' travel in every direction. The community around them had shifted, not dramatically, not without friction, because communities do not shift without friction, but genuinely in the way that things shift when they are shown, repeatedly and over sufficient time, what is actually possible. Henry was 38 when he finally wrote the full account of the Eastern trade routes that the Quarrens Pass Historical Society had been requesting for several years. He had been putting it off because he did not consider himself a writer, and then Zora pointed out that he had been talking about the roads for 20 years, and that writing it down was simply talking in a different medium. He wrote it over the course of a winter at the table by the east windows, and Zora read every section as he finished it and told him without softening when something was unclear or insufficient, and also occasionally when something was good. "This part," she said once, reading about the hill country section of the Eastern Circuit, "is good, very good." "Which part?" he said. She pointed. It was a passage about coming into the Eastern Hills in early spring, about the particular quality of the light, about what the road taught you about yourself by making you spend enough time on it. "Thank you," he said. "Do not let it inflate your assessment of your general abilities," she said. "I would not dream of it," he said. She was 36, and she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in his life, and he told her this frequently enough that she had stopped arguing with it, and had settled into receiving it with the slightly exasperated warmth of someone who knows the compliment is sincere, and has decided that resistance is not worth the effort. She knew, too. She knew the beauty of what they had, not abstractly, but in the daily specific weight of it, in the mornings when she woke to his steady warmth beside her, in the evenings when the children were in bed and the house was quiet and they sat by the fire with their respective work, and were together in the particular richness of that shared silence. She knew it in the way he still brought her things from the Eastern Circuit, no longer the necessity items of their early years, but the small specific things that said, "I was there, and I thought of you." A book of old Orc histories he found at a trade post in Grayville, a piece of patterned stone from a river bed that caught the light the way she liked, a small jar of the particular dark honey from the Eastern Hill hives that she put in her tea every morning. She knew it in the way he had never once, in all the years, looked at her as though she were strange or lesser or outside the category of people who deserved full tenderness. He had looked at her from the beginning as though she were exactly what she was, exactly as valuable and exactly as worthy of care. And this she knew was not given lightly in the world they lived in. This was not something to be taken for granted or allowed to grow ordinary. One evening in the autumn of their 15th year on the property, when Dory was 17 and Myra was 10, and the trade post had just finished its best year in its history, they walked together to the top of the Eastern Hill above the property, as they did sometimes in the evenings when the days allowed it, and sat on the flat stone at the summit that looked out over the valley and the settlement and the road threading east into the hills. The sky was the particular color of autumn dusk, orange and rose and the first deep blue coming in from the east, and the lights of Eastham were beginning to show in the valley below, and the property lay between them and the settlement like a thing they had made with their hands and their years. "I want to tell you something," Zora said. He turned to look at her. She was looking at the valley, the dusk light on her face, and she had the expression she sometimes wore when she was saying something that had been thinking itself into shape for a long time. "When I stepped in front of that arrow," she said, "I told you it was a reflex, that I had half a second and I assessed the risk and acted." She paused. That was true, but it was not all of it. He was very still. "In that half a second," she said, "I also knew that I did not want to live in a world where you had been struck by that arrow. I did not know what that meant yet. I had not put a name to what I felt, but I knew that the world without you in it was less wrong, that it was worth the shoulder." He looked at her profile in the dusk light, at the 26-year-old woman she had been in that moment, and the 36-year-old woman she was now, and he felt the full length of the years between those 2 points like a rope held in his hands, every thread of it known and valued. "Mine," he said softly, giving the word back to her in the form she had first given it to him. She turned and looked at him, the amber eyes in the autumn light, the slight curve of her smile, the absolute presence she brought to every moment she decided to be fully in. "Yours," she said, "and you are mine." He took her hand. She let him hold it, her strong green fingers laced through his, and they sat at the top of the eastern hill above the life they had built together, and the stars began to come out over the old territories and the hills, and the lights of the valley below burned warm and steady in the gathering dark. Dory brought his first serious intention home that same autumn, a young human woman from Corin's past named Elsa who regarded the household with wide eyes and who relaxed visibly over the course of a dinner, as she understood that the warmth of it was genuine and consistent and not a performance. Myra interrogated her about her knowledge of the Eastern trade routes with the systematic thoroughness of a child who had absorbed scholarship by proximity, and Elsa, who turned out to have a good mind and a warm laugh, answered every question with a willingness that rose substantially in everyone's estimation. Henry watched Dory watch Elsa and recognized, with a kind of deep recursive joy, something in his son's expression that he had seen before, in a mirror 15 years ago, in the lamplight of the Copper Fleece's back room, when the world had been smaller and he had not yet known what the years were going to give him. Zora leaned close to him that evening after Elsa had gone, and Dory had gone to his room wearing the dazed expression of someone freshly returned from a country they planned to spend the rest of their life in. "He has your particular way of looking at someone," she said. "Is that a problem?" Henry asked. "No," she said. "I am fond of that way of looking at someone." "High praise," he said. "Do not push your luck," she said. He laughed. He had been not pushing his luck for 15 years, and it was still the best ongoing instruction he had ever been given. The spring that Dory turned 18, he asked to come on the Eastern Circuit with Henry. Not as an assistant, but as a partner. He wanted to learn the route properly, to understand the trade mechanics from the ground up, to carry the work forward. Henry agreed, and they rode out on a cold, clear morning in early spring, father and son, and Zora stood at the gate of the property and watched them go with an expression that was composed and warm and contained, in the way that all of her best expressions did, the full depth of what she felt behind a surface that was steady as still water. Myra came and stood beside her mother and said, "Will they be all right?" "Yes," Zora said. "How do you know?" Zora looked at her daughter, at the amber eyes that were exactly her own, and she said, "Your father knows those roads the way I know leather. He has never made a mistake on them that he did not learn from." Myra considered this. "And Dory?" "Dory," Zora said, "is going to make all his own mistakes in exactly the way he needs to, but he has good judgment where it counts. He learned it here." They watched the dust of the road settle behind the wagon. "Come," Zora said. "I want to show you the new pattern I have been working on. You have your grandmother's eye for line. Tell me what you think." And they went back to the workshop together, orc woman and half-orc girl, and the spring light came through the wide workshop windows and lay across the workbenches. And outside the creek ran full with snowmelt, and the property breathed around them, alive with everything that had been built in it. The years settled into one another after that with the particular quality of time that has been well used, not unmarked, not without difficulty, because no life is those things but full and consistent, and shot through with the recurring evidence of what they had chosen and built together. Ergren died in his stone house in Grafen when he was 72, peacefully and in the company of his family, including Zora, who rode to him when the letter came from Kale, and who sat with her father in his last days and held his hand and sang to him the old songs. Henry went with her. He sat in the outer room of Ergren's house and drank tea with Kale and the neighbors who came to pay their respects, and he was there when Zora came out, and he was there the way he had always been there, present, steady, saying nothing that was not needed and being entirely available for whatever was needed instead. On the road back from Grafen, she was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "He told me at the end that you were a good man." He said it as though it surprised him that it was true. "He was always assessing me," Henry said. "He was always assessing everyone," she said. He assessed the post rider and the weather and the quality of the grain harvest with equal seriousness. It was his way of caring. "And he decided I was adequate," Henry said. She looked at him. "He said specifically that you were better than he had expected and that he had expected quite a lot." She paused. "That is, from my father, essentially a declaration of profound admiration." Henry felt something warm and complicated move through him. "I am glad," he said. "So am I," she said. They rode on, through the hill country, past the way stations and the early spring fields, through the country that had been the route and the life and the road home for 20 years. And when the property came into view through the last line of eastern pines, with the workshop smoke rising and the creek glinting and the house standing solid on its foundation as it had been built to stand, something in both of them eased, the particular easing of return. Henry was 51, and Zora was 49 when Dory's first child was born, a half-orc boy with his grandfather's nose, and the household received him with the deep, unembarrassed joy of a family that had become, over the decades, a fact, not a thing that needed justifying or defending, but a thing that simply was, as solid and as rooted as the stone fireplace and the east-facing windows and the old trade roads that ran through the hills. On the evening after Dory's son was placed in Zora's arms for the first time, Henry watched his wife hold his grandson, and he thought about the market square in Dunhallow 30 years ago, the cold morning air, the snap of a bowstring, and the green-skinned woman at the leather stall who had stepped left without hesitation and taken an arrow through the shoulder for a merchant she had not yet told she loved. He thought about her single word in that moment, delivered with the absolute conviction of a heart that had already decided. Mine. He thought about everything that word had turned out to mean. Not possession, it had never been that, but the declaration of a life chosen and committed to. The staking of a claim not on a person, but on a world where that person would be safe and valued. The unflinching choice of a woman who had lived in a world that offered her considerable reason for caution, and had decided, in half a second on a cold autumn morning, that this particular human man was worth the shoulder. He had spent 30 years trying to be worth it. He thought he had done reasonably well. He thought he was fairly sure that he had managed it. Zora looked up from the child in her arms and caught his eye across the room, and she smiled at him with the full weight of everything she was and everything they had made and everything the years had given them. And he smiled back, and it was, he thought, the best communication he had ever managed without words in a life that had been, for the most part, a good one. Outside, the autumn stars were coming out over the eastern hills. Inside, the fire was warm and the family was gathered and the child was new. The trading post would open in the morning, the circuit would run in the spring, the workshop would continue its work, the road went on. And Zora Fireblood, who had once stepped in front of an arrow to protect the man she had not yet admitted she loved, set her grandson gently against her chest and held him in the steady, certain way she held everything she had decided to keep. And the lamplight was warm on her face, and Henry Dalton, who had spent his life learning to read roads and weather and the subtle language of people who needed patience in order to read the room and found it. As he had found it more nights than he could count exactly right, he crossed to her, he sat beside her. He put his arm around her shoulders, the right shoulder, the one that had borne the arrow, the one that had healed completely and given her no lasting trouble in the 30 years since, which she attributed to the quality of the original poultice, and he attributed to the quality of her constitution, and they had never resolved this argument and they never would. She leaned into him, just slightly, The small unconscious lean of a person who has decided that this is where they belong and has long since stopped requiring any reason beyond that. "Look what we did," Henry said quietly. Zora looked around the room, at Dory with Elsa, at Myra in the corner with a book, at the child in her arms, at the house around them, the fire, the windows, the long-settled evidence of a life. And she said, with the directness that had always been the truest thing about her, "We did well." He pressed his lips to her temple and she let him, and outside the stars turned over the hills, and the road ran on into the dark, and the lights of the property held warm and steady against it, as they had always done, as they would go on doing, the lasting proof of what two people could build when one of them was willing to step left and the other was willing to stay. 30 years. Every mile worth it. Every single mile.